My phone rang at 12:41 in the morning, and the name on the screen belonged to a woman I had spoken to exactly once, for months earlier, when I handed her the keys to the house I grew up in. Daniel. Her voice was steady, but something underneath, it was fraying. You need to see what's behind the wall. I want to tell you who I was before that call, because the man who got in his car 20 minutes later was not someone who did things on impulse. I was 38, an electrician, divorced 2 years, living in an apartment that always smelled faintly of takeout I forgot to throw away. My ex-wife used to say I had a gift for disappearing while still being in the room. She wasn't wrong. The house was 2 hours outside the city, in a small town called Birchfield. I grew up there. My parents sold it when I was 26. I hadn't been back in 12 years. But a midnight call from a stranger pulls at something in a person, and 20 minutes after I hung up, I was on the highway, headlights cutting through fog. Mara Whitfield was standing in the doorway when I pulled in, arms crossed against the cold, a flashlight already in her hand. I didn't go further than this, she said. I called you the second I saw what was inside. She'd been hanging a shelf in the upstairs room, my old room, when the drill punched straight through the drywall into open space. No insulation, a gap built on purpose, tucked between the studs, the kind of space someone constructs when they want it found by exactly one person and no one else, ever. I climbed the stairs 2 at a time. The hole was fist-sized, dust still settled on the carpet beneath it. I shone the flashlight inside and found a wooden box with a clasp gone green with age, and beside it, a stack of letters tied with string that had mostly rotted through. I almost opened it myself, Mara said behind me. It felt wrong, like it wasn't mine. We carried everything down to the kitchen table. Inside the box, a rusted pocket knife, a photograph of a young man standing in front of a car from another decade, a thin gold ring with no stone, and a letter folded separately from the rest, addressed simply to whoever finds this. My hands weren't steady. I read out loud. The letter was from a man named Walter Lang, dated 1958. He'd built this house with his own hands for a woman named Eleanor, who died before they could marry, an illness no one saw coming, fast and merciless. He wrote that he couldn't bear to throw away the things that reminded him of her, so he sealed them into the wall of what would become a child's bedroom one day, hoping whoever slept there would never feel her absence, only the comfort of a love that had once lived in these walls. There's more, Mara said, nodding at the letters. They were from Eleanor to Walter, never sent, found among her things after she died, and kept by him instead. Plain, ordinary letters. She wrote about wanting a long, unremarkable life beside him. Mornings, disagreements, nothing dramatic, just him. I sat with that letter in my hands and felt something I hadn't expected. Not sadness exactly, recognition. I'd slept against that wall for 12 years and never known what was resting a few inches from my pillow. Why are you so invested in this? I asked her. This was my house, but you're the one who tore into the wall looking for nothing. She hesitated. I didn't go looking for anything. I just don't like leaving things unfinished. Old habit. It was a strange answer, and I noticed it land strangely, though I didn't push. We stayed up past 3 that morning, not just on the letters, but on ourselves, my divorce, her reasons for moving somewhere she knew no one. She told me, carefully, that she'd left a relationship that wore her down through silence rather than cruelty. I understood that more than I expected to. Over the following weeks, we kept talking, and we kept digging, not just into Walter and Eleanor, but into the strange fact that hardly anything about either of them seemed to check out cleanly. The town's old newspaper archive listed Walter as a carpenter who lived alone for nearly 40 years after the house was finished, well-liked, private, no children, no other family on record. But a property filing from 1959, 1 year after the letter was dated, showed the house briefly transferred out of Walter's name and back again within 6 months. No explanation. No sale price recorded. Maybe a paperwork error, I said. Maybe, Mara said, but she didn't sound like she believed it, and neither did I. That was the first real crack in the story we'd built for ourselves, and it didn't stay the only one. 3 weeks in, Mara stopped answering my calls for 2 straight days. When she finally picked up, she sounded distant, almost rehearsed, and told me she decided to stop digging into the house's history altogether, that some things were better left in the wall where she'd found them. I didn't understand the shift, and when I drove out to see her, she wouldn't fully explain it. She just stood in the kitchen, arms crossed the same way they'd been the night I met her, and said, "I think I made a mistake calling you that night." I won't pretend that didn't hurt. I drove back to the city without an answer, and for a week, neither of us reached out. What I didn't know yet, what she hadn't told me, was that Mara had found something in the county archive that frightened her badly enough to want to bury it. Eleanor Hart, the woman in the letters, hadn't died of illness in 1957 the way Walter's letter claimed. She'd been listed as missing for nearly a year before a death certificate was ever filed not by a doctor, but by Walter himself, using a county clerk who turned out to be his cousin. There was no hospital record, no cause of death beyond a single handwritten word: consumption. Mara had pulled the actual certificate. The handwriting on it matched Walter's handwriting from the letter almost exactly. When she finally told me this, sitting across from me in that same kitchen a week later, her voice was different, smaller. "I didn't want it to be true," she said. "I'd already decided I liked him. I'd already decided this house was built out of something beautiful, and I didn't want an uglier story underneath it. So I stopped looking. That's the mistake I made. Not calling you, lying to both of us about why I stopped. That was the flaw in her I hadn't seen yet. Not deception exactly, but a willingness to protect a comforting story past the point where it was honest, even at the cost of pushing me away. I understood it. I'd spent years doing something similar with my own marriage, smoothing over cracks rather than naming them. It didn't make it easier to hear from her. "So what actually happened to Eleanor?" I asked. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I think we have to find out together or not at all." We found Eleanor's surviving family through a cousin's estate sale listing. An elderly woman named Ruth, Eleanor's younger sister, still alive, 91 years old, sharp as anything. She agreed to see us on the condition that we brought the letters. Ruth read the letters in silence for a long time before she spoke. Then she told us what her family had never said out loud in 60 years. Eleanor hadn't died of illness. She had left Walter 3 weeks before the wedding, not out of cruelty, but because she discovered by accident that the house Walter was building for her sat on land he didn't legally own. He'd forged a deed transfer from his own dying father, cutting out 2 siblings who never knew the land existed until decades later. Eleanor confronted him. He begged her to stay, told her none of it mattered next to what he felt for her. She left anyway, moved 2 states away, married someone else within a year, and lived a long, ordinary life that had nothing to do with that house at all. Walter never told anyone she'd left him. He let the town believe she had died, because a tragic ending was easier to live inside than the truth, that the woman he loved had looked at what he'd built and chosen to walk away from it. The letters in the wall weren't sent love letters at all. Ruth told us, gently, that those were letters Eleanor had written to Walter early in their courtship, before she knew what he'd done. Letters Walter had stolen back from her after she left, the only proof he had left that she had once loved him before she stopped. The room went very quiet after that. He spent 40 years guarding a story that wasn't true, Mara said finally, so that no one would ever know the real ending was just someone choosing to leave. I thought about that for a long time. Not as a betrayal, exactly, but as something sadder. A man who couldn't bear an ordinary heartbreak. So he built himself a more bearable, more romantic tragedy out of plaster and stolen letters, and lived inside it until he died believing his own version. Ruth had one more thing for us. A photograph she'd kept her whole life. One Eleanor had given her before she moved away. Eleanor, decades later, gray-haired, laughing on a porch somewhere with grandchildren around her. Alive and well, and entirely free of that house. Long after Walter had convinced an entire town to mourn her. She didn't need rescuing, Ruth said. She rescued herself. That's the part nobody in Birchfield ever wanted to believe, because it's a worse story to tell at a funeral than a sickness nobody could stop. Mara and I didn't say much on the drive back. The case in the wall, the box, the love story we'd both wanted to believe in. None of it had been what either of us needed it to be. But something had shifted between us anyway. Not because of a tragedy we could romanticize, but because we'd watched each other choose honesty over a more comfortable lie twice on the same afternoon in the same kitchen. I almost let the easier story win, Mara said eventually. With Walter. And maybe with you too, the day I stopped calling. You didn't though, I said. That's the part that matters. We didn't end up together the way I think either of us expected when this started. There was no grand confession by the fireplace. No neat ending where two broken people fix each other. What happened instead felt smaller and more honest than that. We stayed close, calls most evenings, weekends in Birchfield, but we agreed, without much drama, that neither of us was in any condition to build another story on top of unfinished ones. We gave it time instead of a label, and for once in my life, that felt like the braver choice rather than the safer one. Mara kept the box on the mantel, but she took the letters down from the wall where she'd framed them. She told me she didn't want to live inside someone else's twisted fairness anymore, even a beautiful one. The house didn't get a kinder history. Walter wasn't redeemed, and Eleanor didn't come home. But somewhere in finding that out together, Mara and I stopped needing the story to be beautiful in order to be worth telling. We just needed it to be true. If this story stayed with you, I think it's because of that. Not the romance, not the mystery, but the quiet, uncomfortable relief of choosing what's real over what's easier to believe, even when the truth gives you nothing tidy to hold on to. Thanks for listening tonight.